Okay, Acts chapter 26. This is a very exciting chapter. It seems as if for the past many chapters, Paul has been on trial for numerous occasions in the courtroom. One of the things that we looked at last week in chapters 24 and 25 is that Paul kind of began this whole trial where Felix was first asking him to give his testimony of whether or not the three charges that the Jews brought against him were this. He was stirring up riots. He was a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes, and even tried to profane the temple by bringing in a Gentile. That is found in chapter 24, verses 5 and 6 and 7. And so after that, Felix then is followed up by the next leader, Governor Festus. And so Festus wants to do his due diligence and also hear about Paul. And over time, Paul appeals that he was like, okay, let me present my case to Caesar, which is the Roman emperor during the time. And that emperor was actually Nero, which Nero is the one who ends up beheading Paul at the end of Paul's life. For the first 5 years of Nero's reign, he was not a psychopath. He actually sought wise counsel and governed the Roman Empire in somewhat of a normal manner compared to all the different emperors before him. But then something switched in him, and then he became what is known as, some would say, the beast of Revelation. We don't have to get into that. Many people disagree that Nero was the beast of Revelation. But one of his nicknames was the beast. And if you spell out his name based off of the numbers given, 666, it says Caesar Nero. So that's just my personal conviction. Many other Christians hold that as well. But Nero ends up being a crazy Roman emperor who feeds Christians to lions within the Colosseum, who would light Christians on fire this is where we get the term Roman candles, right? Because Roman candles are the fireworks that scream. He would put Christians on fire to entertain his party guests because he just simply did not care for the Christian faith. So that's the Nero that Paul is appealing to. And so Paul is saying, okay, I need to have my case heard by Caesar because I don't think I'm at fault. I'm trying to stand on my case. And so Agrippa is the king of Judea. He has a Jewish background and he is ethnically Jewish. And so that's why Paul in the early verses says, you know these things. And even at the end, Paul makes an appeal that because Agrippa is Jewish, that he should believe these things. And so Agrippa is doing his due diligence that before he goes to Emperor Nero, that he actually hears Paul out. And so one of the conclusions that we came about over the past couple of weeks is that even in the courtroom, the gospel is going forth in the first century. Paul had been doing many missionary journeys, going to all these different cities, planting churches in Ephesus and Corinth and all these different areas. And over time, he finally is seized by the Jews and then placed on trial by the Romans in the very same city that Jesus was on trial in Jerusalem. And they can't find fault in Paul the same way that they couldn't find fault in Jesus. So there's a lot of parallels between Paul and Jesus towards the end of the book of Acts. And so in what we have in our chapter is King Agrippa is now hearing Paul's case. For context's sake, I want you guys to read with me in chapter 25, verse 23, where this Agrippa and Bernice came with great pomp and entered the audience hall with the military tribunes and the prominent men of the city. This is kind of like a big event. It's not just Paul is presenting his case to King Felix and Bernice. There's a lot of people here hearing this. And so Paul is understanding this is a public setting where he is giving a public defense for what he has done, but he's also publicly defending the gospel. So Paul's being bold even in the courtroom. Paul is preaching and giving a sermon even in the courtroom. This is a very dramatic scene. and many important people are there. And obviously, by the end of this chapter, we see that Agrippa's conclusion is that there is no fault in this man. And in the final 2 chapters, Paul finally makes his way to Rome, which is where he is inevitably executed. But we don't get his execution in the book of Acts. We get his execution in external biblical sources that Nero had him beheaded. If you want to hear more of Paul's end of his life and his charge for us and for Timothy, read the book of 2 Timothy. 2 Timothy is Paul's final letter. In his final words to Timothy, he basically says, preach the word in season and out of season, for this word is inspired by God, and that we can rely upon this word. And so Paul is consistent throughout his whole life, his new life, when he is converted on the road to Damascus. Now, I have inaccurately said that Paul shares his testimony 4 times. I think it's just 3 times in the book of Acts, okay? This is the 3rd time and final time that Paul gives his testimony of when he was on the road to Damascus and he sees the bright light, and Jesus changes him and saves him. Acts chapter 9 is his conversion. Acts chapter 22 is another story of that conversion. And Acts chapter 26, our story, is the 3rd time it is told. Now, when we have various viewpoints of eyewitness testimony, it is important to compare the facts. For instance, Zachary just left. I'm sure that in the reports that night, the numerous police officers and the security detail that were involved in the shooting the other night gave their perspective of what happened. Some officer could have said, I was approaching this man and he did this. And then later I saw the man enter this room and lock himself in there. And so people would give various viewpoints. Luke has given Paul's, from chapter 9, it was an objective viewpoint. Everything that was involved. Paul was converted. Jesus spoke to Ananias and said, you're going to find this man on the street and you're going to go tell him where to go and all these things. And there's a whole bunch of different viewpoints involved in Acts chapter 9. In Acts chapter 22, when it details Paul's conversion, he's more so presenting his case before Jewish people, showing that he indeed is, he's persuading Roman officials that he is a faithful Jew and he is addressing other Jews. Now, here's the 3rd viewpoint, which includes a couple of details that's not in the other previous times, because he is presenting his case before Agrippa, who is Jewish in nature or in his ethnicity, but also very committed to the Romans, okay? So think of Acts 9 as everything that happened in his conversion. Acts 22 is him trying to convince the Jews that he indeed is a faithful Jew. So Acts 26 is more so concerned to a Gentile audience, considering all of those who are watching. And so he doesn't use certain things. He doesn't talk about his baptism here. He doesn't talk about Ananias being this other guy. And so that's why when it comes to eyewitness testimony, when you just think of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they give different perspectives. Some give a little bit more detail, some give less detail to certain stories about Jesus' life. And so this is an instance where we get details about Paul's conversion, where certain details are included or added or excluded. This means that there are no contradictions within his story, but when you measure up why eyewitness testimonies, you can see that this is a valid testimony, okay? Sometimes people will try and point at certain discrepancies in the Gospels considering Jesus' life, but in reality, it's just being told from a different perspective, okay? So as we dive into Acts chapter 26, Paul is now giving his case before King Agrippa and many people. And so now we'll dive back into the scriptures and we'll piece apart this chapter. So Agrippa said to Paul, "You have permission to speak for yourself." Then Paul stretched out his hand and made his defense. This is kind of like a salute to the king, if that makes sense. And also, look at this. We'll see, he's giving Paul the stand, the opportunity to speak. Verse 24, Festus interrupts him. This was not proper. Festus gets annoyed at Paul over time because he's trying to be like, okay, you're crazy. I'm believing the other things. And just know that in a court of law, Festus is stepping out of line and interrupting Paul later. So Paul has the stand here. And here's what he says. I consider myself fortunate that it is before you, King Agrippa, I am going to make my defense today against all the accusations of the Jews, especially because you are familiar with all the customs and controversies of the Jews. Therefore, I beg you to listen to me patiently. And so he just starts off very kindly saying, hey, I know that you are a Jew, King Agrippa, because you're the king of the Judean area. You understand some of the Jewish dialect that comes from what I'm about to share. And so please be patient with me as I unfold my defense. That word for defense here is the Greek word apologesthai, right? This is where we get the word apologia, which is the word for apologetics. Many of us have heard of what apologetics are. Apologetics is the defense of something. And so as Christians, when we say, oh, I know an apologist or somebody who does apologetics, they are into defending or giving an account for the Christian faith. These are like the people like the Cliff Kennedleys of the world, the Gavin Ortlands, or just people who defend Christianity. And so Paul is giving an apologia here, a defense of his faith. It's not like, the word apologize does come from this, but we think of apologize as something that's weak, like, oh, I'm so sorry. The word for apologia is more like defending your faith, not in like a militaristic way, but, giving an account for something, okay? He goes on, verse 4. My manner of life from my youth, spent from the beginning among my own nation and in Jerusalem, is known by all the Jews. They have known for a long time, if they are willing to testify, that according to the strictest party of our religion, I have lived as a Pharisee. And so Paul, at other times, he lists, in the book of Philippians, he gives a list of his qualifications, of all the things that he technically has under his belt. In fact, let me read these verses in Philippians to you. I think it's in Philippians chapter 3. He lists all of these things about himself. Let me find it real quick. He says, he's talking about his flesh as a Jew. He says, for we are the circumcision who worship by the Spirit of God and glory in Christ Jesus and put no confidence in the flesh, though I myself have reason for confidence in the flesh also. If anyone else thinks he has reason for confidence in the flesh, meaning like in their Jewishness, he says, I have more. Circumcised on the 8th day, of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, which is the tribe that produced the first king, Saul, right? And he's named after King Saul, right? A Hebrew of Hebrews, as to the law, a Pharisee, as to zeal, a persecutor of the church, as to righteousness, under the law, blameless. But whatever gain I had, I counted as loss for the sake of Christ. So he's saying, if when it comes to me being a Pharisee, he says, I was the most religious of the religious. I was the highest of the highest. I was the most Jewish of the Jews. And he says, from my childhood, even in Jerusalem, he was in the Jerusalem area as a kid. It is known by all of the Jews. And so he's saying, what I have to say is important. It's like when you speak to a professor who is the leading scholar in their category, you want to listen to that person and what they have to say. That's the claim that he's making. And so verse 6, he says, and now I stand here on trial because of my hope in the promise made by God to our fathers. Cameron, I liked your translation where it talked about the promise, or the fulfilled promise. Read that again.
Now I am on trial because of my hope in the fulfillment of God's promise made to our ancestors.
Okay, good. He has a hope in the fulfilled promise that was made to his ancestors. And the promise is to Abraham, that he will bless his descendants. And the way that he blesses Abraham's descendants is through the Messiah, Jesus Christ. That's how all of the nations end up being blessed. And the way that all the nations have been blessed is through the preaching of the gospel of this Messiah, this Jesus. And so he says, I'm on trial for this hope. Verse 7, to which our 12 tribes hope to attain as they earnestly worship night and day. And for this hope I am accused by Jews, O king. So he's saying, our 12 tribes have attained this hope through this promise. Obviously, there are many within the 12 tribes of Israel that don't believe, and that's why he is being accused by these Jews, because they think that Jesus was not truly the Messiah. And whereas Paul is saying, no, this was the Messiah. This is why they're accusing him of stirring up riots. They're accusing him of desecrating the temple and telling people not to follow Moses anymore. And he's saying, no, I am not abandoning my Jewishness. He's saying, I am embracing who I am as a Jew, but I'm telling them that all of this was about Jesus all along. And so verse 8, he says, why is it thought incredible by any of you, that God raises the dead? So he's saying, because I believe in the Old Testament, because I believe in the law and the prophets and the writings, is why I believe in a resurrection. And my hope is in Jesus, who is resurrected. And so it shouldn't surprise you that I believe in this resurrection, because the whole Old Testament, the law and the prophets, pointed to him dying and raising again the entire time. And so that's why he's saying, why is it incredible by any of you that God raises the dead? Verse 9, he says, I myself was convinced that I ought to do many things in opposing the name of Jesus of Nazareth. Now that's important. A lot of people will just say the name of Jesus, which at the name of Jesus, every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus is Lord, right? But Jesus of Nazareth is very important. I don't know why there's certain weird teachings amongst Christian circles where they'll just deny that Jesus was from Nazareth. I haven't looked too far into that. But when we talk about the Jesus who bodily raised from the grave, we're talking about Jesus of Nazareth. And so it's important to include that in your testimony of testifying of who Jesus is. I'll probably look more into why people deny the whole Nazareth thing, but I don't have much to say on that. Does anyone know much of that? No? Okay. Well, maybe I'll do some more study on that. Verse 10, he says, and I did so in Jerusalem. I not only locked up many of the saints in prison after receiving authority from the chief priests, but when they were put to death, I cast my vote against them. And this is where we see, this is the pre-Christ days, the pre-conversion days of Saul. Saul or Paul, whatever you want to call him. One of the things when we read the book of Acts in chapter 8, it says when Saul, he breathed hatred towards Christians. And that word for breathed is not breathing out, but breathing in, meaning it was in his DNA, this hatred for Christians. And he would vote against them. Kaola sent me something earlier. You should probably send it to the group. Yeah. It was very striking of just kind of, it was from the perspective of, like, say, the disciples of, man, we were scared of this Saul guy, and all he does is say, I'm sorry, and now we have to let him in? I saw him killing my friends in the streets, and stoning them, and it's really portrays forgiveness very well. But I can only imagine what it was like from the disciples' perspective of, oh, now he's claiming to be one of us, But this truly shows that because of Saul's radical conversion, most scholars who try and critique Christianity, they say, we don't see this in history often, when someone is literally killing a people group and then within a month or two is then being persecuted with that people group. And And so he's clearly saying, I used to vote against them. I had authority from the chief priest. I went after Christians. And he says, and I punished them, verse 11, often in all the synagogues, and I tried to make them blaspheme or say, no longer say that Jesus is Lord. He says, and in raging fury against them, I persecuted them even to foreign cities. So he would leave Judea, he would leave Jerusalem, and he would go to foreign cities to try and hunt down Christians who were saying that Jesus had risen. So he had this real hatred. He has this real conversion by the grace of God. Now he gets into this actual conversion. What happened on the road that day when he changed? So verse 12, he tells his conversion. In this connection, I journeyed to Damascus with the authority and commission of the chief priests. At midday, O king, which this detail at midday matches with the other times that this has been shared, about noon o'clock-ish, I saw on the way a light from heaven, brighter than the sun. Now in the other times, this is the time where he actually shares of how bright this light was. When we see his conversion in Acts 9, we do say that it was a bright light from heaven, but this is where Paul gives the extra detail that it was brighter than the sun. It's like, when you're outside, when lightning strikes in the nighttime and you're just like, whoa, that was very bright. It's like stronger than that, stronger than the brightness of the sun. I don't know about you, but this morning I woke up, I don't know why I did this, and I just looked out my daughter's window and looked directly into the sun, and I was like, holy cow, what am I doing? And so he's saying this light from heaven, brighter than the sun, that shone around me and those who journeyed with me. And in Acts 9, it says that the light shine around them, but what's a new addition in this story is verse 14. It says, when we, see that, the third person plural, or first person plural, when we had all fallen to the ground. We don't get that detail in Acts chapter 9. We just see that Paul falls to the ground here. He says, I heard a voice saying to me in the Hebrew language. Now, there's debate here. Are we going to speak Hebrew in heaven? Some people think that we are, so we should learn Hebrew now, I obviously think that if Jesus is a Hebrew or a Jew, and he is speaking to him in heaven, and he's speaking to another Jew whose name is Saul, which is a Jewish name, it would make sense that Jesus speaks to Paul in Hebrew. And so I think that we're all going to understand each other in heaven. We're all going to speak maybe one language, or maybe we'll just all have the gift of speaking in tongues and interpreting tongues at the same time. I have no idea. But it says a voice from heaven spoke to him in Hebrew, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Why are you persecuting me? I know I've said this before, but notice he doesn't say, why are you persecuting believers? He doesn't say, why are you persecuting Christians? He doesn't say, why are you persecuting followers of the way? He straight up says, why are you persecuting me? Which shows that as a Christian, we have this union with Christ, so much so that if we're being persecuted for our faith, it's not just us that's being persecuted, it's Christ himself. And so that should give us comfort as a Christian. When Jesus says, why are you persecuting me? When he was after Christians, he didn't realize he was actually after Christ, because Christ has this union with his bride. And so we should know that when we're under persecution, that Christ is with us. That is something you could take to the bank. And then he says, it is hard for you to kick against the goads. Now, I looked into this phrase. It's just it's a strange phrase. Let me see. Where is the word goads? It's more of like a proverb, an expression. It just means to resist God's will. It's like, it's pointless to try and resist God's will, like an ox kicking the sharp sticks that is used to guide it. This phrase is actually a Gentile-friendly phrase that the Gentiles who are listening would have understood it. Like, why resist something that's inevitable to happen? And so he's saying, it is hard for you to kick against the goads. It's inevitably going to happen. Why try and resist it? which I found interesting. Because I'm sure that there would have been a Jewish phrase that would have matched something like this, but he uses something that would have been suitable to the Gentiles. Because remember, throughout Paul's ministry, he says, to the Jew I became like a Jew, and to the Gentiles I became like a Gentile, so that I may win all people. Verse 15, and I said, who are you, Lord? Capital L, meaning that he is recognizing that this is somebody greater than him, of higher ranking than him. This isn't the word for Yahweh, which when you see that, it's in all capitals, capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D. This is the Lord in verse 15. This is the word kurios in Greek, which is just for the word of like, when you say Lord, as in somebody who has a high rank above you, okay? So he's recognizing that this is somebody of higher ranking than him. Who are you, Lord? And the Lord said, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. But rise and stand upon your feet, for I have appeared to you for this purpose, to appoint you as a servant and witness to the things in which you have seen me, and to those in which I will appear to you, delivering you from your people and from the Gentiles, to whom I am sending you, to open their eyes so that they may turn from darkness to light, and from the power of Satan to God, that they may receive forgiveness of sins and a place among those who are sanctified by faith in me. And so now he includes this part of the story. He doesn't include that he went and got baptized and that Ananias brought him back to where he was going, and then that scales fell from his eyes. He doesn't include these things. He just kind of says, this is what Jesus commissioned me to do, to bring this message, to bring this gospel to the Jews and also to the Gentiles. And during this time, the people listening would have understood that they were the Gentiles. Because they're in the Judean area. They're surrounded by Jews. And so if they weren't ethnically Jewish, they'd be like, oh, this message is for me too? This one that you're proclaiming in the courtroom to everyone who is listening for the forgiveness of sins? And so that they might be not under the power of Satan anymore? I wonder what this moment would have been like in the courtroom. Because oftentimes, when we watch these courtroom shows, it seems to be very individual, very, I'm just trying to convince the judge of my case. Paul is understanding that he's preaching a sermon right now of like, everyone's listening, all eyes are on me. I'm going to use this opportunity to say that, hey, you Gentiles here, this Jesus that I speak of is also presenting himself before you. How cool is that? I think that we need to understand our context sometimes. And Paul definitely understood what was happening here. And so he says that there's forgiveness of sins and a place among those who are sanctified by faith in me, by faith in Jesus. And so now here's his big therefore. He's like, all right, I've presented my case. Therefore, O King Agrippa, I was not disobedient to the heavenly vision, but declared first to those in Damascus, then in Jerusalem, and throughout all the region of Judea, and also to the Gentiles, that they should repent and turn to God, performing deeds in keeping with their repentance. For this reason, the Jews seized me in the temple and tried to kill me. And so immediate, I was converted. I saw this light. Jesus came to me. He told me I was persecuting him. I believed in these things, and he commissioned me to preach. And he says I'm to go to the Jews and then also to Judea and to all these different regions. That has led me to this point, to preach to you. And this is the reason why the Jews who are putting me on trial are trying to kill me. And there must be so much confidence there. Like, I'm commissioned to do exactly what I'm doing right now. That must be scary in the courtroom of like, oh, this guy's pretty confident. He knows what's happening. Whereas they just think that the Jews are bringing this guy who they want me to kill. I want to make sure that I could find fault in him so that, maybe I could hand them over and they could, kill him or crucify him, behead him, whatever it may be. But in reality, he says, All of my ministry has led to this point, to preach the gospel to Gentiles. And he has center stage. Verse 22, he says, to this day, I have had the help that comes from God. And so I stand here testifying both to small and great, meaning the layperson, the common everyday folk who didn't have great status, and great. The king himself is listening. There is royalty before him. So he says, I came here testifying both to small and great, saying nothing but what the prophets and Moses said would come to pass. So he says, I'm not making something up. I'm not making anything new up here. That's one of the hard parts about being a pastor, is the one book that I teach out of is 2,000 years old, and you have to sound creative, but really we're just retelling a story with different emphasis, you know? So he's saying, I didn't make any of this up. This is what the prophets and Moses said would come to pass. I'm just proclaiming that to you. And he says, verse 23, that the Christ must suffer, which this is what we see in Isaiah 53, the suffering servant who is to die on behalf of his people, and that the iniquity of us all would be laid upon him. By his wounds we have been healed, right? That the Christ, the Messiah, that's what the word Christ means, must suffer, and that by being the first to rise from the dead, which was he literally the first person to die and come back to life? No, technically other people had died and risen before. We see the widow's son in 1 Kings 17. Elijah raises the widow's dead son from the dead. And then also we see Lazarus in John 11. We see those who rose from the tombs after Jesus' own resurrection. So he's not literally meaning just coming back to life. When he says by being the first to rise from the dead, he's talking about his theology of Christ being the first fruits of the resurrection. This is what Colossians chapter 1 talks about when he talks about how he is the firstborn of creation. He's like the first fruits of the resurrection, meaning that when Jesus resurrected, he was never to die again. All those other people that resurrected in history also went back to the grave, and they died inevitably over time. Jesus, when he resurrected, he received a new glorified body that had holes in it, right? He tells Thomas to touch his hands, and he shares a meal. Calvin talked about this on Sunday. He shares a meal with the disciples. He eats fish, meaning he's not a herbivore in heaven. Believe it or not, there's a weird sect of Christians who think that God never wanted animal sacrifices, and then they try and make an argument that the fish that Jesus eats, this is the weirdest thing. I spent 3 hours listening to a podcast last year and Wes Huff was debating these guys, and they tried to argue that the fish that Jesus eats post-resurrection was actually like kelp or like a sponge. And I'm like, this is the dumbest argument I've ever heard, but we don't have to get into that. By being the first to rise from the dead, this new glorified body Jesus had, he was also able to just kind of go through a wall. And also we see after he goes on the road to Emmaus in Luke chapter 24, it says he broke the bread. And after he broke the bread, they realized who he was. And then he was not. He just disappears. And so this he has this first resurrected body that is glorified. And so that's what he means by being the first to rise from the dead. And so he says he would proclaim light both to our people and to the Gentiles. So he's not just saying God has moved on from the Jews, which we spent plenty of time debunking all of the modern anti-Semitism. He's saying he is proclaiming light both to our people, which he is a Jew himself, and to the Gentiles. And so now this is where Festus gets upset and he interrupts him. Verse 24, he says, and he was saying these things in his defense. And as he was saying these things in his defense, Festus said with a loud voice. Now, when you write something in antiquity, an ancient document, when you say somebody said something with a loud voice, we could be very sure that Festus was probably very, very loud here. Probably wasn't just talking loud. He was probably yelling this here. Paul, you are out of your mind. Your great learning is driving you out of your mind. So Festus he interrupts. Paul had the stand. He had uninterrupted conversation since verse 2? You're out of your mind. Your learning is driving you out of your mind. But Paul said, I am not out of my mind, most excellent Festus. Kind of like a little backhanded sarcasm, right? Most excellent Festus, Governor Festus. But I am speaking true and rational words. Being calm. He's staying in the pocket here. He's just like, I'm rational, all right? I'm not being crazy. This is where I think when we give a defense for the faith, an apologia, right? First Peter 3:15 says to give a defense for the faith that is within you in a very charitable and reasonable manner. Just because someone's screaming at us doesn't mean we have to scream back at them. And so Paul is, I'm just being rational. I'm not making anything up. I'm not trying to be crazy or super impressive. I'm not out of my mind, most excellent Festus, but I am speaking true, rational words. So he says, now he appeals to the king, for the king knows about these things. I've appealed to the prophets. I've appealed to Moses, right? And to him I speak boldly, for I am persuaded that none of these things has escaped his notice. So he's putting the king on notice before all of his people. That must feel crazy, Agrippa, as he's like, oh man, now Paul's like talking to me directly now, right? And he's making me feel like I have to believe in this Jesus, right? For this has not been done in a corner. He's like, it hasn't been done privately. This has been done publicly. And so now here is the king's response. Or no, he asks him one more question. King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? What a bold question. As Agrippa is a Jew, if Agrippa says no here, he's abandoning everything that he is supposed to believe as a Jew. But if he says yes here, he's accepting that this Jesus is whom the prophets was talking about. And so this is a very public, very intense moment, which we've seen, difficult conversations. I'm sure we've all listened to and seen difficult conversations in the past. And he's putting King Agrippa on spot. Do you believe the prophets? I know that you believe. And Agrippa said to Paul, in a short time, would you persuade me to be a Christian? In a short time, he's like, give me more time. I don't believe just yet. I can't make this decision just yet. And so, is Paul a failure at preaching? I think this goes to show that it doesn't matter how ornate you are in your speech, or how good you are as a preacher, or how knowledgeable you are of all of the facts of Judaism, Christianity, Islam, all the different religions. Paul gives a bulletproof defense of his faith, what happened to him, of Jesus Christ, of how the prophets point to him. He appeals to all of these things, and he finally puts King Agrippa on the spot, and he says, he just caves. I can't believe just yet. You haven't given me enough time. And it's just one of those instances of you could have all the facts, and you could hear all of them, and you could be the best preacher, yet still, Paul didn't fail here. Agrippa, in some sort of manner, hardens his heart here. And he's just choosing not to believe because he's been put on a public platform to make a decision for Christ. And so it's kind of sad. Like, I wish that Agrippa would have just done that, and it would have been this epic display of like, whoa, the king got converted in one conversation, but he's just still holding on to whatever he is holding on to, which is in reality his sin. And so verse 29, and Paul said, whether short or long, doesn't matter how long of the period of time that I give you, I would to God that not only you, but also all who hear me this day, knowing that he's preaching to a crowd, might become such as I am, aka a Christian, a follower of Christ, except for these chains. So he's saying, I wish everyone here was a Christian and they were just as me this day, except that I'm in chains. I don't want them to have chains on their hands, right? And then it says this, then the king arose, and the governor and Bernice and those who were sitting with them, and when they had withdrawn, they said to one another, this man is doing nothing to deserve death or imprisonment. And Agrippa said to Festus, this man could have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar. They still find no fault in him. And so what I think that we need to see today is the gospel reigns supreme. Paul is just pointing to his own personal testimony of how Jesus radically changed him. And he pointed to the law and the prophets, like this chapter alone that is being preached to an entire center of people and to the king himself, which, by the way, is a fulfilled prophecy. In Mark 14, it talks about how the gospel is going to go before governors and kings. Well, Governor Festus is there, and King Agrippa is there. And so he is fulfilling the prophecy that the gospel is going to go forth to all the nations and before governors and kings. He hasn't gotten to all the nations yet. We'll see that in the next 2 chapters, because Rome is the end of the known world. Not the end of the known world, but all roads lead to Rome, right? And Paul's just standing on what is true. And I think that we should as well. We shouldn't cower out when it comes to defending the gospel, when it comes to defending our faith. Because when we do, and when we stand true to our testimony, people won't find fault in us.